Once there was a man who learned that his home was in the path of a local wildfire. He prayed to God, please send help. An evacuation alert, a real one, sounded on his phone. He prayed even louder and more fervently, oh God, please rescue me from this terrible plight. There was a knock at his door. It was a brigade of firefighters who shouted for him to grab his bags and go. Please, God, save me, he cried. That story starts like a joke, and it ends as a waking nightmare. The punchline, which is familiar to plenty of you, I'm sure, is that the man will get to heaven and ask God why his prayers were never answered, and the reply would be that, of course, God had sent help in the form of an evacuation alert and a brigade of firefighters, and so on and so on. It's like number 378 in the great book of Jewish humor. Now, the kernel of truth that makes the joke work, and there is always a kernel of truth that makes a joke work, is that while we're busy looking heavenward for help, often there are earthly angels rushing toward the wreckage. The helpers, the volunteers, right there in plain sight. Amidst the worst of nature, we find the best of humanity. Psalm 121, Esa Enai, depicts humanity gazing up at the hills because surely there, El Harim, up among the majesty of the mountains, will find answers to whatever impossible situation is at hand. But help is often so much closer than the mountaintops. In the great wisdom of Mr. Rogers, in times of trouble, look for the helpers. They're all around. Now this week, when we looked up to the mountaintops and the hillsides, what we saw was threat and danger. What we saw was billowing smoke and the fury of wind-fanned fires. The sheer scope of the disaster fueled our collective sense this past week, at times, of great despair. When the world is out of control, literally uncontained, it is a deeply human thing to dwell in dejection and upset, to cry, to scream, to blame, to beg for relief, the kind that would seem only possible on the scale of a miracle. I tried to think back to the last time I'd really despaired. It was this summer, one late night. It only happened once when we were in Seattle. One of the kids found a splinter in their toe at bedtime. I'm sure he picked it up on the morning's hike. We sat on the floor for an entire hour and tried to get the splinter out. I asked him if I could get the tweezers. No, it hurts too much for tweezers. Some duct tape? My kid looked at me in horror and he said, "You might as well cut off my foot." The foot was doomed. Jews have a word for this sense. The feeling that all is lost. It's called yeush. Now, the Irish writer Samuel Beckett wouldn't have known or used that word, but he did write of yeush, of this paradoxical trauma response, the way we tend to freeze up, stop completely in despair. In his work, The Unnamed, he described it this way: where I am, I don't know, I'll never know. In the silence you don't know, you must go on. I can't go on. I'll go on. I'll go on. I never know how to read that part of the poem out loud. I'll go on. Is that a declaration of resignation or determination? That tension between giving up and giving it your all pervade the writings also of Reb Nachman of Breslov. About 150 years of difference between him and Samuel Beckett. Reb Nachman wrote of Jewish response to despair, "Lo tityaesh, asur lehityaesh." Don't despair. It is forbidden to despair. He also said, remember, things can go from the very worst to the very best in just the blink of an eye. But this isn't the time to preach optimism. Not now, not in the face of tragedy. That would smack of toxic positivity, something unwelcome, an unwarranted demand that we let go of worry, even though Los Angeles isn't the same. And it won't be the same. You cannot smell this ash-tinged air and drive down the PCH and think, this is fine, we'll all be fine. It's also not the time just to repose in gratitude either, even though gratitude abounds. I'm so grateful for so much this week. I'm grateful for the people who made it possible to fill 15 cars and a large cargo van at Beth full of goods for fire relief in the course of just 90 minutes. I'm grateful for the heartwarming video of the guy who got out of his truck to rescue a bunny off the 405. Yeah. I'm really grateful to the people who are hosting evacuees, including in-laws, for the dollars and clothing and food that's donated by the truckload, for the love of friends, for the outreach of strangers. When I look for the helpers, when I look and see all that boundless care, when I see the endless acts of kindness, I do think it's fine. It will all be fine. Bearing witness to the kindness of others is a call to action, to transmute Yeush, despair, into a source of strength. Asor lehityaesh is not a prohibition against worry, it is a prohibition against inaction. Despair is an invitation to do, to mend, to fix, to heal. It is precisely when the strife is so big, so uncontained, so existential, that we cannot see a path forward, that is the time to blaze a trail to the other side of this nightmare. This is a very sacred alchemy. It turns a truism into altruism. We are honor-bound to subvert Mr. Rogers' wisdom, saying, in the midst of tragedy, don't just look for the helpers. Be a helper. Helping is the antidote to despair. In our shared historical narrative, the ultimate setting for Yeush is Egypt, Mitzrayim, the narrow place. How could one not despair under the weight of hundreds of years of enslavement? But the featured characters in our story are interventionists, underminers. They're rebels. They rely on no one but themselves for a miracle. In the plain text, there are Shifra and Pua, midwives who, no matter whether they were Egyptian or Israelite, exercised tremendous bravery in defying Pharaoh's decree. V'tirena hamyaladot et Elohim v'lo asu ka'asher diber alehen melech Mitzrayim v'tchayena et hayaladim. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as Pharaoh had told them. They let the boys live. They saved those babies through the exercise of restraint, non-violent radicalism, heroic insurrection in the face of cruelty, and also deep courage. In the words of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., courage is an inner resolution to go forward despite obstacles. Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? Shifra and Pua turned the swords of despair into the plowshares of righteous action, doing what was right with no time wasted on despair. In the Midrash on our Parsha, we find stories that spotlight Miriam, too, as defender of the hope in the fight against Yeush. According to the canon of rabbinic storytelling, Amram, Miriam and Moshe's father, Aaron made the wrenching choice to divorce his wife. How could they continue to build their home, their family? How could they bring new life into an existence like the one they knew? The Midrash imagines Miriam boldly rebuking her father. Yours is a worse decree than Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh only condemned the baby boys, whereas you would prevent any new life from emerging from this family tree. Chastened, according to the Midrash, her parents then go on to produce Moshe. I tried to imagine for a second what my parents had said had I been so audacious, but I wasn't, and I'm an only child. In the Midrashic imagination, Miriam is the savior of the Jewish line. Her campaign against despair is the key to Jewish survival. Midrash Tanchuma Yilamdenu, a 9th century collection of imagined Torah stories, depicts Miriam as far from alone in her battle against despair. Later in Vayikra, when we witness the construction of the tabernacle, the Midrash raises a curiosity about the materials commanded for use. Why should mirrors be permitted in such a sacred setting? Aren't they, after all, an object of great vanity? The authors of that text return with an answer. In ancient Egypt, in Goshen, after dinner, the women would take out their mirrors and look into them with their husbands. She would say, "I am more beautiful than you." And he would return, "I am more beautiful than you." And as a result, they'd be able to slough off the pain and despair of life in Egypt just long enough to reunite romantically. Professor Rabbi Rachel Adelman describes this historical use of mirrors as, quote, unconventional feminine weaponry, playing the role of powerful Perseus-like shields. Nothing would stand in the way of the Israelite women's desire to be mothers to a next generation of Jews, even then, despite it all. They knew that their greatest revenge on Egypt was to live and to give life. These are the forebearers of our charge to be helpers, the great models of resilience. Now, it is impossible to speak of despair today, and to speak of strong women and mothers, and to speak of models of resilience, and not to speak of Rachel Paulin Goldberg, mother of Hirsch, of blessed memory. She epitomizes a wellspring of determination. In the brutal depths of not knowing yet what had happened, whether he lived, Rachel wrote poems, among them a stunning denunciation of Yeush. Here is a small piece of that poem. And I know that way over there, there's another woman who looks just like me, because we are all so very similar. And she has also been crying. All those tears, a sea of tears, they all taste the same. Can we take them, gather them up, remove the salt, and pour them over our desert of despair, and plant one tiny seed? You must go on. I can't go on. I'll go on. Rachel's vision isn't one of a heavenly bat kol, a voice descending from on high that would bring magical reconciliation. Hers is a prophecy of hard work, a promise to dig and sow and reap. I see that fervor alive in the ones who dig through the rubble of the Palisades and Pasadena, in the ones who dig through the piles of well-intended used clothing, in the tender image of the man in our community who lost his home just this week, walking up to the tzedakah pushka to place $1 inside. Eyes that are not turned heavenward, but to the holiness and the hellscape that both call to the giving urge within. The ones who know that miracles are mostly the stuff of sweat and strength and human resolve. In case you were wondering, we got that splinter out. While my kids stared at the ceiling in quiet despair, I gently nudged the bit at the surface, and it fell to the floor. "Oh, wow," I exclaimed. "There it is. It fell out." "I knew it would come out," he said. You couldn't even tell that anything had happened to the foot. But then again, wounds aren't always visible to the naked eye. The families who are blessed to have the means to replace most of what they lost in the fires, even when they rebuild, they will still live with the pain that their memories are unsettled and unmoored, their home a phantom limb. The families of hostages who, God willing, tomorrow, b'mehera v'yameinu, hear a version of Od Yosef Chai, that their people are still alive. They will still walk the earth the rest of their days with an indelible scar where they wore a piece of masking tape and counted 470 days of unfathomable anguish. That vanquishing of despair. I pray they find peace, that someday the scars fade just a bit. You know, when he looked down at his splinter-free foot, my kid said, "It's a miracle." All it took was a little help.